Hey, folks. After we taped this episode of Sound Politics, some news broke involving one of the stories that we talked about. The Washington State Republican Party filed a lawsuit against the King County Elections Director. They're challenging the county's use of an app to fix problems with the ballots in the state lands commissioner race. Our colleague Jeannie Lindsay has more reporting about this over at KUOW.org. All right, on with the show. We're talking about space today, Scott, so I think it is actually vital for Earth's defense that we get to the bottom of this weird sound that the Boeing Starliner was
Earth's
making.
defense.
Yes, this
Okay.
week. It is very strange, and just take a listen. Like, what do you think that is?
A horrifying thing to hear when you're in space, alone. Although I was going to say it sounds kind of like the ghost of Jacob Marley, like
Spooky.
dragging his
Yeah.
chains. Yeah.
I think it's some Cylons, but they look just like the astronauts.
Like Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's the steelworker from J-Lo's Heart Factory from This Is Me Now.
It was Ben Affleck thinking he heard the Heart Factory trying to get back into J-Lo's heart.
It's Jeff Bezos. He's stopping by to be like, keep it down.
Yeah.
You're too loud.
Yeah.
Well, okay, there is actually an answer to this. NASA says it was feedback from a speaker, the result of an audio configuration issue. So it was just feedback, AV issues.
No, this is a PNW Politics episode about space and voting. There is only one person it could be. Good space guy.
It all ties back to local politics. All right, it's time for Sound Politics. Welcome to Sound Politics, the show about the people and policies that affect your future in Washington State. I'm KUOW's Libby Dankman.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. Coming up on Sound Politics, we got a great question about absentee voting. Not for Americans living abroad. Think further away, like 250 miles above sea level. We're going to talk about how astronauts vote.
How they vote from
space, the final frontier.
In space, no one can hear you vote, I assume. I guess we'll find out.
Who's your captain? Is it Picard? My captain is Picard.
It's Shatner, sorry.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Kirk.
Not Cisco.
I mean, I grew up terrified of like that salt-like monster in the early seasons. So yeah, Shatner's my guy.
So the whole conversation about space was inspired by the Boeing Starliner astronauts unexpectedly and inconveniently stranded at the International Space Station, which is tough stuff for Boeing, but an opportunity to get nerdy about elections, so we're going to take it. But first, let's start closer to home.
On land. Get it? Because the Lands Commission. We're going to talk about Lands Commissioner.
Yeah, I get it. Scott, the Washington State primary for this Lands Commissioner race has been grabbing a lot of attention. It is ridiculously close. We know that one candidate, Republican Jaime Herrera Beutler, is through to the general election in November. So this has been a race for second place. And it looks like after a hand recount, the first one in a primary in this state since 1960, Democrat Dave Upthegrove has clawed his way back into second place by just 49 votes. 49. So catch us up on why everyone was watching this race so closely.
If you ever thought your vote didn't count,
Seriously,
it does, even for Lands Commissioner. And yeah, like we've talked about, Democrats basically screwed up and fielded 5 semi-viable candidates at least, and Republicans fielded 2. So they were hoping that those 2 would get more votes than any one of the 5 Democrats. You with me? Right? So basically, since only the top 2 advanced, they were hoping 2 Republicans would advance to November, which is called a lockout, but that has not happened. This was, like you said, the closest primary in state history, according to the Secretary of State, which means it's just catnip for election nerds and watchers. People were texting me saying things like, Upthegrove has overperformed in Chelan, and just insane stuff that you say when you're watching Washington state elections very closely. But more importantly, this job, it just has a lot of leeway over how the state's public forests are harvested or not. And we'll talk about more in a minute. But like you said, the recount is in. It only changed the original results marginally, something like 3 less votes for Dave Upthegrove last time I checked. It looks like we will have a good old-fashioned Democrat on Republican race for Lands Commissioner in November. Republicans can challenge the recount by Friday, but their time to do that is running out.
Yeah, clock is ticking. So the recount, like you said, didn't change that much. But Scott, you did a story about something else that happened after initial results were announced that might have gotten Upthegrove over the line. So what's the deal? What happened?
Yeah. So when a race is as close as this lands commissioner race ended up being, both parties mobilized to do something called ballot curing. The goal with that is to make sure every vote got counted, especially when there's a razor thin margin like this one. So I went out with some volunteers to see how ballot curing works in action, or as I kind of found, doesn't sometimes. And just a week or so after the primary, so what is that? It was before the DNC, so it feels like years ago. But I took a trip to exotic Finney Ridge, which I caught myself saying to my source, I have this on tape, Finney Ridge is hip? When did Finney Ridge get so hip?
You're officially in your 30s.
I think so. I think
Welcome.
I don't think anything changed on Finney Ridge. Like, I've been going there for years, but now I'm in my 30s and I was like, whoa, wait a second, the self-serve wine bar, that's actually cool as hell.
Yeah, it starts to look better and better as you get older. So welcome for sure.
Anyway, I was with Lisa McCrummon, who lives kind of halfway between Finney Ridge and Greenwood, which I learned is called Finneywood. So she's just like knocking on doors, trying to contact voters, doing what we in Washington State call ballot curing. Some people actually call it ballot rehab.
Oh, I'm trying to imagine the Schoolhouse Rock episode with ballot rehab, and the image that comes to mind is really depressing.
No.
What has the ballot been getting into? But what is this stuff? Like, what does ballot rehab or ballot curing actually do? How does it work?
I'm only a Bill whose wife left me. So these voters...
I'm a Bill that's hit rock bottom.
I'm just a Bill. So these voters whose doors I'm watching Lisa McCrummon knock on, their ballots were rejected, right? Have you ever had your ballot get rejected? It actually happens a lot more often than I thought. About 25 to 35,000 ballots get rejected a year.
I am a former politics reporter, and I obsessively check my signature, and I kind of have like shaky hand when I'm signing my ballot. Like, I'm so worried I'm going to get my signature rejected. I'm one of the very few people who probably even thinks about this. But yeah, I've never had my ballot rejected, luckily.
Me neither, even though if I even get to like the R in Greenstone, it's a good day.
Yeah.
Like it is way different depending on, how tired I am, how much I'm, multitasking, whatever.
I want like an A+ from those county ballot workers who are like looking. I want them to be like, beautiful.
You won democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, so I've never had a ballot thrown out either, even though my signature, I would get like a total, like a D probably. And because it doesn't happen very often, it's something like 1 in 200 ballots or so. It's only like 0.5% of ballots. But basically, these folks who Lisa McCrummon is knocking on these houses, their ballots were rejected. And so she's basically saying, hey, there was a problem with your vote. We need you to sign this signature resolution form and get it into the county elections office. And you need to do it soon. In fact, she started off calling people and texting people, and this is like her last ditch effort. We should mention actually here that like you and I, well, we're young people, so like our ballots are more often getting rejected. That statistically, young people just don't have signatures that are totally solidified. But also people with Asian and Hispanic names, according to a UW study last year, they might shorten their names, and statistically, they're more likely to have their signature change and their ballot thrown out. That's what Lisa McCrummon is going to great lengths to fix. She and hundreds of volunteers. They called over 9,000 people, and they knocked on almost 3,500 doors. And I mean, this is like really tough work, and it doesn't really have immediate results, right? Like, I'm going around with her, and people are very clearly on vacation. And she's like, oh my God, they voted and went on vacation. Are they going to get back in time for the deadline? She went up to an apartment building and tried to, obviously got stopped by the person's call box and tried to leave, a message for them, and the call box kept like ringing. So if you listen to the feature that I did, which I think the link will be in the show notes, you can hear her like frustration. It's
really
frustrating
difficult.
work.
Yeah, it's like doorbelling, and you're specifically going after people who, they feel like they cast their ballot. They did their homework. It's
That's
not
right.
like the get out the vote effort before an election where people are thinking, yeah, I need to do that. Okay, I'll answer the door to whoever, is talking about elections, or I'll answer my phone. It's
that's a very, very optimistic way to look at how voters interact with
sure,
door knockers.
But you at least have a percentage of people who understand what the volunteers are doing. But if you feel like you've cast your ballot already, you're not going to, answer the door, pick up the phone. You're like, I did my thing. Leave me alone.
Yeah. And this person is not official. This is a volunteer saying there's a problem with your vote. Like, I would be kind of suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
And again, they reached out to almost 13,000 voters. Only 2,400 of those folks actually cured their ballot. And they think that only like maybe less than 900 of them were actually Upthegrove voters.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, these are Democratic volunteers that you followed.
Yeah.
How do they know the people that they're knocking on the door of are Democratic ballots that are going to help them? And in this case, it's like there's other Democrats, in this race that people would have voted for. How do they know it's specifically going to help Upthegrove, which is the only thing that matters at this point in the last few days of before certification? Like, we don't have party registration in this state. What do they know before they knock on that door?
Yeah, it's just a hope and a prayer. But they say they're extremely confident that those are Democrat votes that they got. And here's why. They can cross-reference donation data. And when you vote, there is no party registration, like you said, but when you vote in a presidential primary here, you do have to mark, if you vote for a Democrat, you have to mark, I prefer, the Democratic Party. And they can also get other data from other people who've knocked on these doors, like you mentioned, during campaign season, who like basically entered the voters' like partisanship score or something into a database. But that said, the Upthegrove campaign told me that, they don't really know how many of those were Upthegrove votes. So it's a ton of work. And it's not totally clear if you're going to, if it's going to result in the outcome that you want. Although this time for Upthegrove, it did. Yeah.
I mean, he seems to think that it helped. And ultimately, when you're trying to scrape together just a few dozen votes that are going to make the difference in this race, every single one counts. Talk to me about the context here, Scott. So Upthegrove is ultimately going to meet Jaime Herrera Beutler in the general election in November.
Yeah.
Jaime Herrera Beutler, former Congresswoman from Southwest Washington. Upthegrove is the King County chair of the King County Council. Why are people putting so much money, resources, all of this attention into the job of lands commissioner?
Yeah, lots of hopes and anxieties running on this race. So again, that volunteer, Lisa McCrummen, that I followed, she feels very strongly that she wants to protect the state's, green spaces for future generations, like her son, who's outdoorsy. She's also very outdoorsy. We got in her car and she was like, I'm sorry for the smell. I just went on a river walk yesterday. It did kind of smell like a riverbed, but
wow, you're putting her on blast for her smell.
No, she said it was, actually I didn't ask her, but I'm sure she's fine with it. But she's been volunteering so much for Dave Upthegrove because he has a plan that he says will protect mature forests that were cut before 1940. Those are sometimes called legacy forests. But Republicans I talked to are worried that his plan would amount to, fewer trees cut and that it would hurt rural economies and take away jobs. So, that's why they devoted so much time and effort as well. Down in Pierce County, the GOP was calling up lots of folks as well.
Yeah, and Jaime Herrera Beutler is not like, from what I've read in interviews, I haven't interviewed her yet, but she's not saying I want to cut down a lot more trees. She's basically saying I think that the trees that are protected under existing law is okay. And Upthegrove wants to expand that to include these forests that are, around 100 years old or so. And then there's also the issue of like school funding that comes from the sale of, some of the forest products that come from state lands. There's shellfish involved. There's like tidelands that this job covers. It's pretty interesting how wide-ranging the lands commissioner gig is. The GOP also holds no statewide offices,
Yeah.
Scott. So this would have been a huge deal, right, for Democrats to have blocked each other out and there to be just 2 Republicans in the general election. It would have guaranteed a statewide office for Republicans when they haven't had one in a while. Again, it didn't happen. Jaime Herrera Beutler will be on the ballot in November with Dave Upthegrove. But on the subject of ballot curing, I do have this image, like you said, of hearing people knocking on their door, saying there's something wrong with their ballot and going, what? Like, huh? I mean, it kind of feels a little sketchy. Like, is this something that people know about? Is this something that only happens in Washington state? Is there controversy about it?
Yeah. It's people do sometimes get weirded out, to your point. I've talked to people who said, like, can I see some ID? And they're like, oh, we're with the Republican Party. This person said they're a Republican. Like, we're not official. We don't have, badges or anything like that. And this is kind of a new. It's new in the since the advent of mail-in, voting systems. So yeah, most people don't know about it, right? I talked to the chair of the Pierce County GOP. And he's done ballot rehab several times, including winning races for Republicans because of his efforts. And he talked about, walking up to a house where he said the lady of the house had a problem with her ballot, and her husband answered the door and says, who are you and why are you looking for my wife?
Yeah.
But yeah, the PNW has more experience, I would say, with ballot curing than most places because Oregon and Washington have, required mail-in options longer than most states. And so those mail-in options require signatures. Signatures mean sometimes the ballot's rejected. Ballots rejected mean ballot curing. But I would say about half of, states in the U.S. from reporting I've seen have some process in place for fixing problems with your ballot. And they have in other states, they have, generated controversy. There have been legal fights like in Pennsylvania recently, kind of part of that whole patchwork of, Republican versus Democrat legal fights leading up to this election that the New York Times, wrote about today and things like that.
Yeah. So do we know, is there a way to nail down exactly how many ballots were cured, what the difference was made in the race by ballot curing? Like, how many did the Republicans cure, for example?
Yeah, they say they, quote, probably cured about 800 ballots, and that's not nearly as many as the Democrats cured. And they're not. They didn't say how many of those. I asked, but they didn't respond. At least last I checked, about how many of those were Jaime Herrera Beutler ballots. They think, or Sue Keil-Peterson ballots. But I wanted to know this. The answer to this question too. So I asked Todd Donovan, who is a poli-sci professor at Western Washington. He's also on Whatcom County Council. He's been on county canvassing boards that certify cured ballots. And he said, this is his email, one could say that curing decided the election if we knew how well the D's versus R's were at identifying who they targeted. My guess is yes, because he said the Democrats cured lots more ballots than Republicans.
Like 3 times as many.
Yeah, right. And I think across the political spectrum, from what I've seen, people say, ballot rejections because of signature issues are a problem with the mail-in, vote system. So like there is, going back to that controversy question. I don't know about controversy, but people do feel like this is a problem. The authors of that UW study, it's like too many ballots are rejected. So the fact that the Democrats could win because they have more volunteers, do we, if some people may have a problem with that. Right. So like, and of course, Republicans do as well. The Pierce County GOP chair that I talked to, he said, like many Republicans, he wishes we could go back to the days when you have to show up in person at the polls and show ID. But other folks say, this is a problem because of how many ballots get rejected each year. It's a problem built into that mail-in voting system, and we should just improve that. I mean, I think there are still almost 7,000 ballots sitting at elections offices around the state that don't count because no one submitted a signature or resolution form. And that's how we don't know if this tipped the election, right? Mm-hmm. If those ballots are all Upthegrove ballots, then no, this didn't tip the election. But of course, they're going to be a mix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a symptom, right, of the mail-in system that we use here in Washington state. And there was a law passed earlier this year that expanded the ways that the Secretary of State can contact you if your ballot needs to be cured. But it does seem like a question that Democrats and the Secretary of State have been wrestling with is how to better message this, make sure people know about it, make sure people have all the tools that they need to respond if they want their ballot to be counted. And we should say, in terms of what this means, Dave Upthegrove, the Democrat, and Jaime Herrera Beutler in the general election, this spells a big challenge for Herrera Beutler, right?
It would have been much easier for her to beat Sue Keil-Peterson, another Republican who is almost a perennial candidate at this point.
Yeah, and Jaime Herrera Beutler, much more name recognition, being, one of the few Republicans who cast a vote to impeach Donald Trump. You're looking at about 42% of the primary vote that went to Republicans cumulative in this August 6th primary. And, just overwhelmingly, if you add all the Democratic votes together, it's a big uphill climb for Jaime Herrera Beutler. She's saying she's up to the task and going to try to convince some people to switch over or, folks who didn't vote in the primary. So we'll see what happens.
And the Trump people do not like her either. So she's going to have to, because she voted to impeach Trump when she was in Congress. So she's going to have to persuade those folks as well.
Yeah. Another issue with the mail-in ballot system, Scott, that is that you cannot mail your ballot from space. And normally that only affects a very few number of Americans every year. But this year, courtesy of a little company called Boeing, there are 2 voters who are unexpectedly not going to be home this November for the presidential election. And we're going to talk about what they're going to do about that.
When we come back, space voting
on Sound Politics. Hey, it's Libby Dankman and Scott Greenstone. We're back with more Sound Politics.
And Libby, the other day, our producer, Jason Burrows, came across a really good question on X or Twitter or, the Muskverse, whatever the kids call it these days.
I think the kids call it that place where those screenshots we see on TikTok and Instagram come from.
The question had to do with a kind of, extreme absentee voting that's out of this world, you might say. 2 astronauts who launched on the Boeing Starliner are stuck at the International Space Station for months longer than they planned. And now they won't be home until early next year when a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft will pick them up. Thank you for the Dragon name, Elon Musk.
Huge bummer for Boeing.
And we saw a question about that from Crystal Fincher, who's on the line. Crystal is a political consultant and the host of another informative local politics podcast. It's called Hacks and Wonks. Crystal, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
So last week you posted on X, Brave, and I quote, "Will the stranded astronauts be able to vote? Obviously not their most pressing issue, but I'm wondering." Crystal, what was going, through your mind when you asked your followers about this?
Like a lot of other people, I've been following the saga of the stranded astronauts now that they are officially confirmed to be stranded. And I just gotten done with a conversation with a friend who was going to be out of town during the election. And so we were talking about, okay, so what's the plan for voting while you're out of town? Do you need to, register? Do you need to, make arrangements? And so that was in my mind when I'm hearing about these astronauts who are stuck on the space station for a lot longer than anticipated. And it's going to be during the general election. So I was wondering, are they going to vote? How can they vote? Will they be able to vote? It's not like they planned to be at the space station before. So I was wondering what that whole process was, if they could vote.
Yeah, these are Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, the astronauts' names. This was supposed to be an 8-day trip, so the first manned mission by the Starliner. But there were some helium leak issues, trouble with thrusters on the Starliner. Boeing said it was safe, but NASA made the call that the return trip was too dangerous for that capsule. So the 8-day trip has now stretched to 8 months approximately. They will be there until February when the SpaceX capsule is supposed to be able to get them. Starliner itself is returning to Earth on Friday empty with nobody inside, which is really tail between its legs. Really sad outcome for the Boeing space division.
I didn't realize Boeing said it was safe, but like NASA's like, we've seen the doors on your planes. We're just going to be careful.
Yeah, the thrusters are really important, which is, kind of a side. We're talking about politics today, but the thrusters are important because when you are re-entering Earth's atmosphere, you have to have the right attitude or else you pretty much burn up. So all of this has, again, as Crystal is saying, caused a really big change of plans for SUNY and Butch. And we want to talk about what they're going to do in terms of their civic duty. Yeah.
Do not get Libby started on. I think you were talking about when we were pitching this. You were like, "Oh, I can reach out to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory."
Yeah, I was really getting excited.
So yeah, it's a presidential election year. Obviously, we don't need to tell you that. And Libby, you have been looking into, aside from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory stuff, you have been looking into the voting in space thing. So can you tell us? Can astronauts cast ballots?
Yes, they can. It turns out Texas passed a state law in 1997 after there was an astronaut aboard the Russian space station Mir who couldn't vote for the 1996 presidential. So Bob Dole versus Bill Clinton. And that prompted a Texas state senator to hear about this. He sponsored a bill. He says one of the reasons he found this like an interesting bill to sponsor was that he had won his office originally by only 7 votes. So he thought, astronauts, every single vote counts. Kind of shades of the Lands Commissioner race, right? And the first American astronaut who did vote in space was named David Wolf. He voted in a local Texas election in 1997. And here he is talking with NPR in 2008. He really was kind of emotional about the right to vote and the ability to vote in space. He said that when he was on Mir, he was feeling isolated as the only English speaker, and being able to cast that ballot was a big deal.
It's something that, you might or might not expect it to mean a great deal. But when you're so removed from your planet, small things do have a large impact.
And he said in other interviews that, the act of voting just feels more intense and emotional when you are in an extreme environment like space.
Okay, well, I mean, some of us don't need to go to space to get emotional about voting. In the March, I actually talked to a Snohomish County voter who voted in the Democratic presidential primary, and she said she cried for 2 hours before voting for Biden.
It's a beautiful thing.
I'm not making that up. But how does it actually work? It's not you're not mailing your ballot to Texas.
No, we don't have mail in space exactly.
Okay,
they do ship supplies up, but it doesn't happen that often. So we reached out to NASA about this. There's also been some good reporting from other reporters. The astronauts have to register to vote. And as far as we can tell, everyone who has voted in space did so with a Texas address. The Johnson Space Center, the mission control is in Houston. So astronauts on the space station, they get sent an encrypted PDF of the ballot. They fill it out and they send it back. The encrypted file gets relayed from a satellite down to a ground terminal at a NASA lab in New Mexico. Then that data is sent via landline over to Houston. And NASA in Houston sends that encrypted file to whichever county the astronaut lives in, the residence is registered in. So then there's a clerk at the county office who takes the file, the encrypted file, opens it up with a password, hand fills out an actual ballot in the county, and that is counted just like the rest of, the regular ballots. There is no I voted sticker, by the way, for astronauts.
Oh, criminal. I think they should get like a special, I voted in space sticker because if you did a design competition for that, like kids, they would just have a field
They'd go
day.
wild.
Yeah.
I think that's just called being an astronaut. Like that's your prize, right? For the rest of your life, you're an astronaut.
Kids love participating in democracy. They don't care about space. So Crystal, your question inspired this whole thing. Has your thirst for knowledge been slaked? Is it now on your bucket list to go up in Jeff Bezos's spaceship just long enough to vote?
That actually is not on my bucket list.
Smart lady.
Bezos or Musk or the Boeing, capsule that is together at the moment. I think I'll be fine here on Earth, but it is comforting knowing that there are arrangements made for our astronauts. They deserve to vote.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, right? I was inspired. I got a little civic pride by hearing about all the ways, like the clerk who takes the space ballot and actually fills it out. It's pretty nice.
Yeah, the space ballot. Before we go, this is obviously an extreme example of something that happens a lot more commonly in elections here in Washington. People who are overseas for various reasons, sometimes work or school or military deployment, they can cast ballots for our elections. And when we were talking about this in our pitch meeting, we were kind of wondering how often does this happen, or how far away? What are some of the examples of the most far-flung places Washington voters have cast ballots from? And Libby, you looked into that a little bit.
Yeah. So Crystal's friend who's going to be out of town, for example, there are ways that you can request a ballot. If you are living overseas, if you are a military member or their family who has been deployed, counties send tens of thousands of these ballots out every election cycle. They are officially called under a 1986 law, Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act ballots. They have to be sent out 45 days before elections. That's one of the reasons that the printing deadline for ballots is so early. It's for the military and overseas ballots.
That's coming up.
Yeah. And there is also an electronic option that's required to be offered if paper ballots won't work. So Pierce County, in terms of how often these are sent out, Pierce County is a place with a lot of deployed service members who have residence there because of Joint Base Lewis McChord. They have a lot of personnel in their families. They told me that the county has almost 15,000 active military and overseas voters in their roles. But participation in this category, I found this interesting, is quite low. For example, Snohomish County told us that they had sent 7,182 military and overseas ballots for the August 2024 primary, this last primary. Just over 940 were returned. Ooh. So that is about a 13% participation rate. I know it's a primary, but that's still really low compared with the rest of the state.
Well, what about the rest of the nation?
Yeah, I mean, the participation rate for these ballots is just really low in general. The news site, The 19th, reported that in 2022, only 26% of active duty military voted compared to 46% of the general population. So even though there's 75% of the members of the military are eligible, the participation rate is just a lot lower. And, they're busy. They're in far-flung areas. It's really disorienting and hard as a family when you get uprooted, when you get deployed all over the world. But, that is the status of participation right now. And I will say, just on a happy note, these ballots come from all over the world. Pierce County says that they've had people send ballots in from camping trips, like in the middle of the wilderness.
Mailbox Peak.
Yeah, I mean, literally, right? I will never do that hike again. King County sent us pictures of thank you notes from voters from all over the world. They were sending them in from Italy, Kathmandu, Nepal. There was even one from a research station at the South Pole in Antarctica. Which is awesome.
That's all I wanted from this segment. Space and the South Pole. Crystal Fincher, any final thoughts? What is the weirdest place you've voted from? Or is it on your bucket list to vote? Maybe from Kathmandu, not Jeff Bezos's Blue
no
Origin
spaceship, but what about Mount Everest?
Yeah, right.
I don't know about that, but some fantastic vacation locale, something like that would be fantastic. I wouldn't mind being in a tropical location. I wouldn't mind being, voting from South America, voting from West Africa. Those are possibilities.
How about Majorca?
I'm holding up for them. Absolutely. Absolutely.
What if we all book tickets to Majorca right now so that we are not here in November? Does that sound good? And request our ballots?
Crystal Fincher, as a political consultant, would have no issue with that.
Yeah, certainly. And us trying to cover the election. So, Crystal, did your friend get sorted out too and how they're going to vote when they're out of town?
They did. And part of that conversation was helping them figure out a plan. They did. I'm glad that so many people are thinking this through and that there are processes in place. I'm just thinking about the military and their ability to vote. Some of them are on the front lines of existing and emerging conflicts. And wow, talk about being directly impacted by some of the decisions that could potentially be made.
Yep.
So I'm glad they have every opportunity to vote, and I hope more exercise it in the future.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you again for being here, Crystal.
And thanks for the great question.
Absolutely.
It inspired this whole segment. It was really fun.
Thanks so much. Thanks for diving into this.
And Crystal Fincher is also the host of Hacks and Wonks. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts, also on KVRU.
And that's a wrap for Sound Politics this week. Today's episode was produced by Noel Gasca and Jason Burrows. It was edited by Catherine Smith. I'm Libby Denkman.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll be back with Sound Politics next Thursday.
And this show is only possible through donations from our listeners. So visit KUOW.org/politics to donate and keep our podcast and others like it going strong.
And we want to know your thoughts on the podcast so far. So share your feedback or your questions, like, voting in space. How does it happen? At soundpolitics@KUOW.org. Again, that email is soundpolitics@KUOW.org, or you can leave us a good old-fashioned voicemail at 206-221-0511. Again, that's 206-221-0511.
Crystal, who's your favorite Star Trek captain?
Picard, man, Picard.
Yes!
Okay.
Yes!
I mean, Picard is that's the basic answer. Everyone's going to say that.
Or the right answer. I mean, there's a
Janeway.
reason why.
Come on, I want to meet.
people
Come on,
would say-
Janeway is.
Janeway is
I did
an
behind
absolute
Shatner.
despot. Listen, are you serious? She's an
maybe-
authoritarian.
Maybe it's the Orange is the New Black fan in me actually just saying, "Wow, Janeway's great," because it's can't remember the actress's name.
Catherine Mulgrew. Janeway murdered Tuvix, and always remember that.
Oh my gosh, I love it. I love it.